And what those policy initiatives are, in a nutshell, is attempting to create political mechanisms that can manage cross-strait economic relations, to stabilize cross-strait relations, both political and economic, and to maximize economic cooperation for mutual benefit. Again, we can argue about whether or not the particular measures the Ma government has undertaken are the right measures to achieve those goals. But I would say that those are the goals that they are seeking to achieve. And at the same time, making it clear, the Ma Ying-jeou administration wishes to make it clear that it will not submit to China politically. This is also part of the Ma administration's approach. Whether everyone in Taiwan or anywhere else thinks that it is sufficiently resolved to that end or not, that is, I think, what the approach is. So, next question, will it work? We don't know. That largely depends on what the Chinese leadership decides to do. And I would say, just then to conclude, to bring it back around to the Taiwan Relations Act, because we don't know whether this approach will work, and because we don't know exactly what the approach how this approach will evolve, certainly President Chun's approach to cross-strait relations evolved in very significant ways and to a very significant degree over the years of his presidency. Because we don't know these things, that's why the U.S. needs a very smart policy toward Taiwan and toward Taiwan-China relations. We need to be ready for the success of Ma Ying-jeou's policy, should it succeed, which would mean stabilized cross-strait relations without unification. We also need to be prepared for the failure of, or the incomplete success of Ma's policy, which could manifest in a downturn in cross-strait relations. So these gestures and developments turn out not to be sufficient to maintain friendly relations across the strait, or could manifest itself even more disturbingly in an overreaching gesture by Beijing to go beyond what is acceptable to the Taiwanese electorate that would then produce a backlash in Taiwan that would be particularly damaging. So I think the best approach for the U.S. is to be open to the possibility of a realistic rapprochement, which seems to be what the Ma administration has in mind, while at the same time being prepared for the possibility that for reasons originating either in Taipei or in Beijing, this realistic rapprochement is unsuccessful. And this is a development or an approach for which I think the Taiwan Relations Act, precisely because it is so flexible and yet so durable at its core, is actually pretty well suited.
Shelley, appreciate it. James?
Thank you, Mark. And thanks also to Project 2049 for inviting me today. In my view, this is an important new organization with an important mission, a very unique voice and place here in Washington, particularly as we confront these new issues in Asia and in Taiwan. I don't think Kurt Campbell's here, but in homage to Kurt, I'd like to make 3 quick points. First, confronting directly this issue of the Taiwan Relations Act and its relevance or continuing relevance in the defense realm, I was struck as I was thinking about it today of a certain irony, which is that the Taiwan Relations Act was passed in the late 70s at a time when Chinese military capabilities presented little, if any, credible threat to Taiwan. Very little amphibious lift, no missile forces. And ironically, we find ourselves now that the PLA, since 1979, has experienced what can only be called a revolution in its military modernization, tilting the balance in the favor of the PRC. And so now we find ourselves in the defense realm that the Taiwan Relations Act is more relevant than ever. And perhaps, therefore, looking back, the Taiwan Relations Act vis-a-vis what was going to happen with Chinese military modernization turns out to actually be quite prescient. And I find that interesting. But my second point would be to look at the dynamics of this military modernization, which I think are more cross-cutting, more complex, more mixed than we initially see at first glance. In the spirit of the 9/11 Commission, let me state some of my assumptions up front. I fundamentally believe that Beijing has a political strategy for reunifying with Taiwan that has a military component, not a military strategy that has a political component. I always find it interesting in my mind that the latter, that they have a political strategy that has a military piece, is universally believed in Taiwan, is universally believed in China, and I often find the only place where the opposite view is held is in Honolulu and within the National Capital Region. But depending on which of those two perspectives you have, in my view, it drives you towards very different conclusions about the nature of military modernization, what it means for cross-strait relations. And so I think it's important to be explicit about that. From the perspective of the Chinese military, ironically, Taiwan has been the best and the worst thing that's ever happened to them. If you go back and you read Chinese military writings in the 1980s, there was a remarkably ambiguous lack of direction or guidance. They were grasping desperately for some sort of a concrete reason to ask the leadership for more resources to pursue a more aggressive modernization program. And in the early 1990s, the Taiwan situation certainly gave that to them. It finally provided them with a concrete planning scenario and the resource justification that has resulted in almost 20 years of double-digit budget increases. At the same time, I believe that when you read internal writings of the Chinese military, there was also a certain trepidation that in the middle of that revolution, because they knew that they wanted to walk a very thin line with the Chinese leadership. On the one hand, they wanted to convince the leadership that if the balloon went up, that they had options. At the same time, they didn't want the civilian leadership to become so confident that they would write a check that the PLA couldn't cash. And so they had to walk a very thin line in that respect. And I think that particularly in the last couple of years, they have achieved a certain level of capability, which ironically has created a situation in which the civilian leadership could be more comfortable about pursuing cross-strait rapprochement. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I would also, just as a parenthetical, highlight that Hu Jintao's notion of the new historic missions that he outlined in 2004, in my view, is a very clever move by Hu Jintao to point the PLA towards a situation in which the Taiwan situation may in fact be resolved or may in fact decline in intensity and nonetheless continue the justification for large-scale resources being given to the Chinese military, because it highlights a completely new set of missions that can improve their combat capability that are not solely Taiwan-related. In this respect, I of course agree 100% with the pregnant but often very lonely sentence in the China Military Power Report for the last couple of years that Chinese military modernization has now exceeded or gone beyond simply the Taiwan scenario, with unfortunately no elaboration for the general audience to understand why. It's important, in my view, at the strategic level to understand from the Chinese perspective what the two centers of gravity are in a Taiwan situation, because it highlights why they've gone down certain modernization paths. The first center of gravity, in my view, is the will of the people in Taiwan. I didn't used to believe it or phrase it that way. I actually took that phrase from a man who I consider to be very smart, General Tang Fei. In Taiwan. And the first time he said it to me, I thought, that's the most incredibly jingoistic thing I've ever heard. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized General Tang Fei is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. Because fundamentally, it does come down to the issue, particularly given the kinds of weapons China was procuring and the kind of battle that they were foreseeing with Taiwan, that it fundamentally came down to the psychological ability of the Taiwan people to be able to resist coercion, particularly in light of the lack of Chinese capability for many years to actually get troops across the water. The second center of gravity, and by the way, to attack that first center of gravity, the Chinese military has obviously pursued this very aggressive modernization program with missiles. I would also concur, obviously, with Peter about the cyber element and even the fifth column and special forces threat to the island. The second center of gravity, though, may be more germane even than the first to the Taiwan Relations Act, because it is directly confronting U.S. military intervention on behalf of Taiwan in a contingency. And here, this is the logic behind the very robust and highly lethal program we've seen over the last 20 years of procuring area and access denial weapons designed to shape and hopefully even deter, from the Chinese perspective, U.S. military intervention, particularly with carrier strike groups. And thus, we see the anti-ship ballistic missile program, wake-homing torpedoes, anti-ship cruise missiles, and even at the level of nuclear deterrence, the deployment of the DF-31 road mobile Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles, which in my view, for the first time, gives China a credible second strike, whereas before they largely had a psychological second strike against the United States.